Hello, welcome to Colloquium. Before we begin, let me start with some official announcement. As you all know, this is going to be the last time we're going to meet in this class, right? I know. We always have next semester, don't we? However, I don't want you to forget to submit a summary report next week, which is 3rd of June. And due date for the final report, which is related to your prospective thesis, is 10th of June, following week of next week. Okay? So let me repeat. Due date for the summary report about today's lecture is 3rd of June. And due date final report is 10th of June. Okay. And today, I'm so glad I can invite Ambassador Park Soo-gil. Prior to his election as president of WF-UNA in year 2010, he served as the Republic of Korea's ambassador in the Kingdom of Morocco, Canada, to the European Office of United Nations in Geneva, and the United Nations in New York from 1984 to 1998. And at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, in which he served from 1963 to 1998, Ambassador Park held such positions as Director General of Treaty Affairs, Deputy Minister for Political Affairs, and Counselor, the Institute of Foreign Affairs and National Security. He was Chief Representative of Republic of Korea when South Korea was elected as the member of UN Security Council from 1996 to 1997. He was president of the council in May 1996. And currently, he is a distinguished professor of GSS KU. And he's going to deliver a talk on Korea's role in the UN and responsibility to protect. Please welcome Ambassador Park.
저로 올라갈까요? 네. 대단히 감사합니다. Thank you very much for your very warm introduction. 서서 하는 게 나은가? 됐습니다. 제가 매니저서 이렇게. What a pleasure to see you, to see each and every one of you. By the way, it is going to be the last day of this semester? Very last day. I see. I don't know how many of you ever heard of the concept on the responsibility to protect. Can you raise your hands if you have any prior knowledge or prior information about this concept of responsibility? This has a lot to do with what happened in Libya a couple of years ago when Gaddafi's government was collapsed because of intervention by the international community headed by NATO forces. Anyone heard of this concept, responsibility to protect? None. Well, then, none of you ever heard of this concept? Yes. Yes, please. Yes, yes. I think your answer was quite good, and I think I feel more comfortable with standing here. Can you hear me? Can you hear me clearly? Because I have severe cold. See, even at my age, I was born in 1933, and therefore I'm approaching rapidly the age of 80, sometime this year. And that I try to be as active as possible so that I can do something useful for the members of younger generation. That's the reason why I decided to come to this university to speak on this topic. As a matter of fact, I did have, as was mentioned by Dr. O, I did have quite an experience with international organizations. I was based in the United Nations in New York, to be more precise, from 1995 to 1997, during which Korea sat on the Security Council. As you know, Security Council is the most important body in the United Nations, although it doesn't turn out to be as effective as you expect it to be because of the exercise of veto from time to time. You vividly recall what happened in Libya when Gaddafi was in power. Yes, we have a student from Africa. Can you tell me why Gaddafi was thrown out of his power? Why?
I'm not so certain, but the issue is a bit controversial. But it is alleged that Gaddafi failed to protect his citizens who were suffering from atrocities and massive human rights violations.
Mm-hmm. Well, I just wanted to sound you out in order to find out how in-depth analysis I should give about this concept of responsibility to protect. But now, on the basis of what I heard from African students and the impression I get from you, let me start by saying, by making a few remarks on my recent visit to New York. I am currently president of World Federation of United Nations Association, which is called WFUNA, which stands for WFUNA, World Federation of United Nations. It is one of the non-governmental organizations which was set up in 1946 in order to enhance the relevance of the United Nations so that United Nations can become a more effective organization in dealing with global issues. That's the reason why I was in New York and had a meeting with Secretary General, of course, who is Korean national, as you know too well, on a broad range of issues from North Korean threat to Millennium Development Goals and post-2015 Sustainable Development Goals. Many of you are, I'm sure, well aware of what this Millennium Development Goals are all about. Does anyone comment on this Millennium Development Goals? It was, yes. Does anyone have any knowledge about Millennium Development Goals? It was agreed at the summit meeting of 2005, which took place in New York. And agreement emerged from that summit meeting. Designing that poverty level, global poverty level must be reduced by half by 2015. 2015 is only a couple of years away. And it turned out to be a very successful project because, as a matter of fact, poverty level of global poverty level is drastically reduced because of the common efforts of members of the United Nations, which collaborate very closely with the World Bank. So it has a very distinguished achievements thus far. As a matter of fact, it is fair to say that Korea has done very well. Speaking of Korea's role in the United Nations, considering its relative short history of full participation in working with the United Nations. I hope you read that slide. It is fair to say that Korea has done well. As you know, election of Ban Ki-moon to head the body and his re-election last year to a second term was, it gives a great sense of pride to the Koreans. Of course, his re-election was in appreciation of his quiet but effective leadership, which has won many successes against the complex political exigencies that UN had to address. But there have been other high points as well. Korea served a term on the UN Security Council in 1996 and 1997, and is serving a second one in 2013 or 14 this year. In other words, this year, Korea again sits on the Security Council. Many Koreans have emerged as experts on global issues such as human rights, nuclear arms control, disarmament, public health, climate change. Korea is now well placed to contribute to enhancing the relevance and the impact of the United Nations in leading the world to greater peace and prosperity. With this remark, brief introduction with the Korean role in the United Nations, let me proceed to the concept of this responsibility to protect. See, responsibility to protect. This is the concept intended to protect innocent civilian populations from four grave crimes, four categories of grave crimes. Does anyone have any knowledge about four categories of grave crimes? Can anyone talk about what kind of four grave crimes UN addresses? Four crimes? Genocide, that comes first. Ethnic cleansing, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, right? I want you to remember it. genocide, ethnic cleansing, war crimes, crimes against humanity. In a nutshell, the concept says that while nations are sovereign inside their borders, they have corresponding responsibility to protect their populations from those four crimes. If a national government is unwilling or unable to offer the protection to its own people, this concept of responsibility to protect comes to the international community. In other words, to cite a specific example of this case, Gaddafi was fighting his own people. Those who tried to bring him down from the region of Benghazi. But what Gaddafi decided to do was to kill them, to mask them. He said that there would be no mercy on them, and he was determined to kill his own people. And this is the very time when international community should intervene. This is what the right to protect people from atrocities, atrocious act. See, there are some in Rwanda, and see, we have students from Africa. In Rwanda, about 1 million people were killed because of conflict between Hutu and Tutsi, right? Even that period of killing taking place all across the country, international community simply stood on the sideline without doing anything, including the United Nations. As you know, this world became increasingly global and interconnected. Atrocities halfway around the world were brought into living room by television. Concept of human rights and fundamental freedoms for all people came sharply into focus, and government heard a loud outcries from their citizens with family or ethnic ties to nations or part of nations wrecked by war and unrest. Perhaps inevitably, concept of humanitarian intervention, it began to develop in the last few centuries, had to deal with the situation. But it was constrained by the principle of national sovereignty. But nations increasingly became willing either to break the rules in pursuit of higher moral goal, or to seek loophole in that principle to justify their action. Some of these interventions were unilateral. For instance, United States intervention in Dominican Republic in 1965, or Vietnamese intervention in Cambodia in 1978. Others were multilateral, such as UN-sanctioned intervention in Somalia in 1992. Events in Rwanda, East Timor, Kosovo showed that there was both a need to intervene in some cases and the better rules for deciding when and how to do it. The record of 1990s were very mixed. In Kosovo and East Timor, civilians were protected through international peace operations that had the Security Council's blessing. Rwanda, where the world community stood by despite a bloody genocide, became a blot on the international conscience. Sovereignty and humanitarian action have always been uneasy bedfellows. United Nations is at its heart a political organization, and the international politics loomed large in decisions about the use of military force to protect people from massive violation of human rights. Former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, reflecting widespread horror over the shame of Rwanda, asked crucial question when he addressed the General Assembly in September 1992. When should the international community intervene to protect people at risk? It took the theme of human security and humanitarian intervention in the new century as a major subject of that address. He argued that core challenges for the Security Council and the United Nations as a whole was to forge unity behind the principle that massive and systemic violations of human rights should not be allowed to stand. A Canadian government-sponsored organization, the International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty, presented a report in 2001 arguing that sovereignty is not a right, but a responsibility as well. In other words, the world has a responsibility to protect people from atrocities if national governments are unable or unwilling to do so. African Union in its Charter of 2005 declared that it had the right to intervene if a member state was not protecting its people from genocide. The AU troops once serving in Somalia are a concrete expression of that principle. And at the 2005 UN World Summit, world leaders brought the concept of responsibility to protect into the international spotlight through paragraph 138 and 139 of the summit outcome document. The world leaders unanimously affirmed that, and I quote, each individual state has the responsibility to protect its population from genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. They agreed as well that the international community should assist states in exercising that responsibility and building their protection capabilities. When a state, nevertheless, is manifestly failing to protect its population from the four specified crimes and violations, the leaders said international community is prepared to take collective action in a timely and decisive manner through Security Council and in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations, including Chapter 7, which governs intervention with force. To put it briefly, with the approval of Security Council, international community can intervene in what normally would be a nation's internal affairs. Is slide moving, by the way? Is slide changing? Because indeed, international community through the United Nations has the responsibility, not only the right, to use appropriate diplomatic, humanitarian, and other means in accordance with chapters 7 and 8 of the UN Charter to help protect populations at risk. The important point to be made here is that intervention should begin with diplomatic efforts and then later to turn course of actions should peaceful means fail to stop any of the four crimes cited. R2P, that stands for responsibility to protect, has now found a foothold in international law. The summit declaration came as a surprise to many people, however, and was seen in some quarters as an idea that managed to survive the summit's deliberation, only because the leaders' attention was focused elsewhere on poverty and development issues. Can you follow me? See, at the World Summit of 2005, head of states were preoccupied with development and poverty issues. So they could have an oversight on this important clause, in spite of the implications it could bring about because of their agreement to this concept. Because in a sense, this is a different version of international humanitarian intervention, responsibility to protect. Because it is on this right to responsibility basis that NATO forces decided to intervene in Gaddafi, in Lebanon, to bring down that Gaddafi regime. Can you follow me? So when four specified crimes, I'm talking about four specified, I want you to remember that specified crimes, okay? Genocide, ethnic cleansing, crimes against humanity, war crimes, okay? State must protect their own people against those four specific crimes. If state is unwilling to protect its own people from massive violation of these four crimes, then international can intervene with the invocation of this responsibility to protect. And this important clause was included in the summit document of 2005 in New York. So I hope you get the implication of this right to R2P, okay? Secretary General Ban Ki-moon in January 2009 proposed a three-pillar strategy to put the idea of responsibility to protect into practice. Three pillars to implement R2P. One pillar is state responsibility to protect. State responsibility to, in other words, state does have sovereignty, but the sovereignty has two sides, two dimensions. One is right, but on the other, it's a responsibility too. If a sovereign country doesn't exercise its due right to protect its own people, it could pave the way for international community to come in. So you can easily see how that sovereignty can be diluted depending upon the rule of any government act. If rule of that government, such as Gaddafi, or how about the situation in Sudan? Do you now have an elected president in Sudan, right? Democratically elected president in Sudan. Sudan is now at peace with its own people, right? So important thing is state does have sovereignty. Everyone recognizes it, but it is also a responsibility to protect its own people from four categories of crimes I have mentioned. Now, in case state is unwilling or unable to protect its own people, then international assistance to build state protection capabilities. So international community must provide assistance. That's what they mean. And furthermore, when atrocious act take place, any government, timely and decisive response must be given in order to put an end to atrocious acts, even by a sovereign country. So no longer these days, no longer a country can claim to have exclusive right to deal with their own people in a way they like. In other words, dictatorial regime is no longer accepted by this concept. And this concept came into being in the Summit Declaration of 2005, as I said. But since heads of states were so preoccupied with development issues, therefore, they might lightly thought about inclusion of this clause without knowing the serious consequences. Okay? Now, diehard defenders of pure national sovereignty suffered another defeat when serious situations developed in the Middle East, Arab Spring. In mid-February of 2011, triggered by revolutions in Tunisia and Egypt, violence erupted in Libya, and the government of Gaddafi responded with savage force. On February 17, the UN Security Council referred a matter to the prosecutor of International Criminal Court with the intention that Gaddafi, on charge of crimes, commission of crime against humanity, be brought before the International Criminal Court and ask for an investigation of possible crimes against humanity. And then on February 26, Security Council called for and imposed sanctions on Libya. So I don't know whether we have a student from China and Russia here, but in adopting resolution on Libya, which was under Gaddafi's rule, even China and Russia came on board. That's the reason why NATO forces were able to launch its attack on Gaddafi regime. Now, around the civil society groups also joined the call for action as the violence escalated. And 6 Arab states, I'm talking about the situation that provided Libya, and 6 Arab states who made up the Gulf Cooperation Council declared on March 7 that UN Security Council should act to stop the bloodshed. African Union consists of 50-some countries of African countries, also joined a strong call saying that fighting posed a serious threat to peace and danger to people living in Libya. African Union rejected foreign military intervention though, but called for the formation of the political party to mediate between Libyan government and the rebels. On March 12, the Arab League also called on the UN to act, but echoed warnings against foreign intervention. Before this organization acted, many Western nations and NATO had made it clear that they would not take any action without approval from regional groups and Security Council. By March 12, they had a Security Council resolution that approved at least peaceful intervention. And then on March 17th, the Council passed a second resolution that called for imposition of tougher sanctions, including no-fly zone over parts of Libya to protect vulnerable civilian population from attacks. The resolution was passed with abstentions by Russia and China, because if China and Russia decided to stand in the way, no resolution could have been adopted. And it was fortunate that they decided not to exercise their veto, in spite of their earlier position that they would oppose any intervention. On the same day, Gaddafi said in a radio address that his forces would attack Benghazi, Libya's second largest city, that night, and would show no mercy to fighters. Although the government reportedly declared a ceasefire in the wake of the Security Council action, fighting continued. And on March 19, American, British, French aircraft made their first attack against Libyan air defenses and other heavy military forces. You are familiar with the ending of the story, and I went into some detail about the beginning, only to highlight how a confluence of political and humanitarian drives led to the first application of R2P norm. What then are the implications of this first case of R2P's application? First, behavior of the Libyan government was ruthless and cruel. Phrases like no mercy or rivers of blood were used by Gaddafi, and the scale of the attack was massive. In the world's eyes, a failure to react would have been unthinkable, and new R2P vehicle was seen as an appropriate method. Just before the Security Council board, Gaddafi told Portuguese television, if the world is crazy, we will be crazy too, expressing his determination to kill his own people. Second, the support of regional organizations was crucial in invoking this concept. Although inclined not to approve any use of force at first, position of the Arab League and the African Union hardened after they saw the Libyan violence and continue and intensify. Without that support, Europeans and Americans would have hesitated even longer to act. Third, although R2P was invoked and used, some doubt that anything has really changed. These observers question if the concept of changing from just a rationale to a more solid part of international law and practice. Despite some setbacks, most notably current situation in Syria, a consensus emerging rapidly toward giving R2P the status of rule of international law. You know what happens these days in Syria. More than 700 people have been killed by the Assad regime, and yet internal fight is still going on, and we expect increasing number of people will be killed unless international community decide to stand by without having the courage to intervene. United States, of course, thinking about intervention, but they would like to have collaboration with some other countries from Europe, and including members of Arab League too. So we will see what will happen in Syria. See if responsibility to protect can be implemented without consideration of power politics, then this responsibility to protect should have been invoked by the Security Council a long time ago, given the increasing number of people being killed in the Syrian situation. But it did not work that way because of the veto power in the Security Council. As you know too well, Russia and China, they are not too keen about giving up on their veto in dealing with the Syrian situation. Now, in the remainder of my remarks, I would like to discuss some points in more detail, which might be of interest to you. Now, part of the difference between older concept of humanitarian intervention and R2P is that R2P seeks to head off the necessity for armed intervention, if possible, by first using peaceful means. Debates are now going on about how to set up a monitoring and early warning mechanism to identify possible trouble spots and method of persuading involved nations to resolve them before trouble turns violent. If those efforts are successful, they will go a long way toward satisfying critics of R2P who see no interference in domestic affairs of any kind as the only work norm. In other words, many countries in this world, in the international community, they still believe in sovereign right of their country in dealing with their own people. Therefore, they feel uncomfortable with this concept of responsibility to protect. But this concept, because this concept paves the way for international community intervention in internal affairs, the so-called internal affairs. But these days, boundary between domestic and internal affairs is becoming more and more dimmed, so that no ruler or no dictator can deal with their own people in a way they like. To repeat, but I like to repeat this. Let us not forget the United Nations is the place where lofty visions for humanity meet old-fashioned power politics, with Security Council action still subject to veto by 5 permanent members. It takes unusual circumstances or blatant violation of international law to avoid a veto. Principles and politics are often like oil and water. They sometimes don't mix. A good current example is Syria, where the Assad government is behaving in a manner very similar to that of Gaddafi. The prospect for any intervention there to protect Syrian civilians, however, not very good. Syria is a crucial element of Middle East politics, most prominently as a factor in the search for a solution to Israeli-Palestinian standoff. Further complicating the matter are the links between Syria and Iran. Assad also has strong and vigorous support from Russia and China, and it seems to me that violence in Syria would have to escalate even more dramatically before that support would begin to weaken. Even then, it would probably take a level of global interest and outrage far beyond what exists now to induce China and Russia to change their positions. However, the Arab League took the initiative in suspending Syria's membership in the League and later imposed tough economic sanctions on that country. Reactions to the decision taken about Libya and the emerging events in Syria clearly show the philosophical issues that are still to be addressed and folded into a coherent international legal framework on R2P. In a recent commentary, David Hillstrom, an American expatriate author in Europe, attacked the links between intervention under R2P principle and the requirement for action by the Security Council to justify intervention. To him, that requirement indicates that the whole process is flawed. Approval or rejection of intervention is based on UN power politics, not on legal framework. You know what this exactly means. See, if responsibility to protect can be carried out on the basis of international law, then only matter is to implement. But simply because of veto powers in the Security Council, that cannot be done. See, this is why the critics talked about the merits of, not only the merits of responsibility to protect, but also the merits as well. We would comments on Syria, as you know too well, note how power politics interfere with desire to protect population. The case is perhaps more clear-cut here. For the reasons I mentioned earlier, it's too early, though, to talk about R2P's promises and shortcomings in categorical terms. In other words, we have to wait and see how well this responsibility to protect can be implemented. It could be argued, for example, that pressure from other Middle East nations and regional and international organizations could lead to greatly weakening the Assad government without external military intervention. While I share a touch of cynicism that has been expressed about efforts to stop the violence, the fact is that Assad has been severely isolated politically and economically, and in deep distress. The large majority of the world's nations are troubled by what's going on in Syria. There is still a possibility that R2P will be invoked to stop the violence there, and certainly prospects for the Assad regime are dim unless it can address the demand for reform from its own citizens. Speculatively speaking, could the R2P principle apply to North Korea? Remove politics and factors other than humanitarian, and the answer might be yes. With a recent history that includes the death by starvation of perhaps 2 million of its citizens, presence of forced labor camps where distant and other so-called enemies of state are held in abominable conditions, and a regime that disregards most basic of human rights, a case could be made that outside humanitarian intervention or R2P is necessary. There are 3 reasons, though, why this is no more than a thought experiment. First, R2P is aimed more at acute problems rather than chronic ones. North Korean case is chronic ones, as you know, chronic one. The case for intervention would have been stronger in 1995, while mass starvations were occurring than it is now. However, much the situation makes us recoil. It is stable at least for the moment. Second, it's unrealistic to try to exclude politics as a factor. China is North Korea's patron and lifeline, and Chinese interest in keeping a security buffer between China and North Korea makes Chinese support for North Korea will not go away easily. Russia has similar interest and sees rekindling its once close ties with and influence in North Korea as key to its diplomacy in Asia. Finally, there is one huge other factor in the mix, North Korea's nuclear program. Its position of nuclear weapons, however crude and unreliable, should almost automatically block any thought of vigorous intervention to make North Korean citizens' lives more humane. That caution applies not only to China and Russia, of course, but to us, to Americans and Japanese, and to wider world. Again, R2P meets the political realities here. But these cautions and roadblocks, however difficult they may seem at the moment, are no reason to stop working on the concept. In 2000, it would have been difficult to imagine for more than the most optimistic dreamers in the world that the international community would agree to the concept of responsibility to protect and rework the principle of sovereignty. But in 2005, it did, and with continued effort, I'm confident that there will be more breakthroughs in the future. In closing, I'd like to make a few additional points. First, the work of the United Nations sometimes misunderstood. Former Secretary General Doug Hammarskjöld said, UN was created, not created to take mankind to heaven, but to save humanity from hell. That thought could have been in the minds of many during the evolution of responsibility to protect concept. Recent history has shown us the difficulty involved in coming to an agreement on how to apply R2P consistently. But consistency is crucial if it is to be a part of international law. In his most recent report on R2P, Secretary General Ban drew few lessons from recent history. He said, every situation is different, while R2P principles should be applied as consistently as possible. The tools to enforce those principles may vary widely from case to case. That said, using different tools may lead to changes of applying a double standard. To prevent or minimize that from happening, senior UN leaders and Security Council must be as explicit and consistent as possible in explaining the justification for their actions in each case. None of three pillars of R2P can stand alone. The world community cannot withhold aid to a government struggling to prevent genocide, war crimes, and ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. And only intervene when force is required. Neither can it afford aid alone and wash its hand off any further intervention if that fails. Let me quote one of Secretary General Ban Ki-moon's point. Quote, and I quote, an effective and integrated strategy is likely to involve elements of both prevention and response. Every situation addressed over the past 4 years has required a mix of preventive and responsive measures with a balance between the two varying with the circumstances of each case. Neither offers promising result without the other. Finally, Mr. Ban noted, experience has shown the importance of working with regional partners in addressing problems related to R2P. African Union and the Arab League have been invaluable partners in their respective regions, and the UN should continue to develop relationship with such groups. And so the work of the UN and the world community continues. Problems are complex and there are no easy solutions. I am sure that you will inherit many of these problems, and your hard work will be necessary to continue movement towards solutions of global issues. I speak for my colleagues of my generation when I say that I share your dream of a better world. And I envy you because you will be the ones to get the world closer to making that dream come true. You have my best wishes for success in whatever career you choose. And I urge you to consider a career in international affairs, whether it be with a national government, with the UN or a regional multilateral body, or with a humanitarian group in civil society. We have now time for some discussion. And I would especially like to ask you for your thought on the following 3 points. The UN response to crisis in Libya was a rare example of vigorous action to support human rights, despite the highly political atmosphere of UN Security Council. Was it a sign? Excuse me, can I have a glass of water? The student, can I have a glass of water, please? I have a bad cold. Was it a sign that the UN has shifted? Thank you very much. Was it a sign that the UN has shifted and now consider human rights more important than national sovereignty? Or was it unique or possible only because Gaddafi was considered not only a cruel dictator, but a clown as well? R2P adds responsibility to rights in the definition of sovereignty, but it has been inconsistently applied. If Libya, why not Syria? Do you think that the UN should develop specific benchmarks that would, if violated, automatically trigger the international community's responsibility to protect? 20 years from now, do you think we will look back at the UN response to the Arab Spring as a success or failure? Now, I would like to open the floor for any questions or comments. Any of you have, yes, excuse me. Yes, please.
Thank you. For Syrian situation, first of all, after less than 10 days in Libyan situation, with less than 10 days, there was about 200 to 300 killed, and there was intervention.
Excuse me. I don't hear too well. Something wrong with my microphone. Can you use your? 잘안 들리네. 여기 뭐죠? Yes, can you speak a little bit louder so that I can?
Yes, I'm talking about Libyan situation. Libya. In Libya, after less than 10 days, there was intervention from Security Council, and there was less than 300 killed in Benghazi. But in Syrian situation now we have 70,000 killed, and today regime started using chemical weapons against people, and they have about 6 million displaced. outside Syria. I think there is a decision, it's only power matter. There is a decision between big countries, especially Russia and the United States, to divide Syria to 3 countries. Because the situation now in Syria, this is the 3rd year for what happened there. So if there is any interventions would be happened with current situation, no way for any interventions, because there is physical military troops or maybe groups from Russia in Syria, and there is a very complicated situation there. So we think in Arab countries, we think that the situation in Syria going to divide this area to 3 countries. In Libya, there was like common understanding or common interest between big countries to finish Gaddafi regime. So there was no conflict of interest between these countries. But there is the situation that there was before a few years, talk about reforming of Security Council and United Nations. This is a solution for any upcoming maybe progress in this field, because the situation is now only but power matter. United States, Russia, interest areas, that's it. This is my point of view. Thank you.
It's a good point. It's a good point. See, that's the reason why I was talking about the need to consistently apply this concept in a situation where so many people are killed, or so many people will be killed. In other words, if responsibility to protect this concept is applied only where the country is weak, then it loses consistency, because this is not the concept. It should be applied selectively. See? Power politics should not stand in the way of applying this concept, ideally speaking. But case such as Syria is very difficult one, because there is a conflict of interest of big power there. Russia does have some kind of facility there, right? It also does have long-standing good country. And furthermore, another complicating factor with the Syrian situation had to do with the conflict among ethnic groups. For instance, current President Assad, does he belong to Alawite, right? Alawite group. And therefore, she's simply trying to apply this concept of responsibility in that country, even when big powers are ready to do so, will not resolve the delicate problem that exists within that country. So I think we have to look at the application of this concept commensurate with concrete situation and circumstances. Yes. 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 Yes, please. I will move from left to right, okay?
Thank you. I have one question. My question is, some people believe that this the right of international community to protect is just taken by great powers, especially US and the UK, in a way that once these great powers, if they don't like or they influence the UN agents to intervene at a particular scenario. What's your view regarding to this?
Again, it's a good point. As a matter of fact, this responsibility to protect can only be invoked when Security Council agrees to this. See, this is the problem. In other words, see, that's the reason why critics say that, see, regardless of how much we talk about the importance of this right, simply because of veto access, simply because of the possibility of disagreement among veto exercising powers in the Security Council, it doesn't mean too much significance. That's what they say. So as a matter of fact, according to what was agreed at the summit, and later in the Security Council, and even in the General Assembly, agreement was presupposed among the veto exercising powers when this responsibility to protect is to be exercised. So as a matter of fact, depending upon how you interpret it, this situation, maybe one can not give too much credit to this concept. But in spite of big powers not agreeing on the actual application of this concept in certain country, still many scholars and many practitioners argue that this concept already has a legal footing in international law. It may be a too optimistic view, but by saying so, we are pushing this concept to actual application in concrete situations. Yes.
Thank you, Ambassador Park. What are your thoughts on whether if Libya and in the past and
Excuse me.
oh, I'm sorry.
I can, yes, please.
Thank you. So what are your thoughts on whether if Libya in the past and Syria, currently they're just being used as scapegoats in the international community in order to touch, the tip of the iceberg on nations such as North Korea, because the security, like you said earlier, Han, there is different problems for differences in using R2P on North Korea is because of nuclear weapons or that it wouldn't be passed in the Security Council. So it's a way to kind of like limit them, say that we are looking at you and we're trying to keep you in check, instead of actually utilizing R2P, which is kind of impossible right now in this situation with North Korea.
See, in case of Libya, the people of Libyan people are very fortunate because then there was no disagreement among the big powers. In other words, even Russia and China were willing to come on board, as I said. But when it comes to such countries as North Korea, number one, North Korea question is chronic nature. It's not the acute one right now, although they threaten South Korea so many times with a nuclear bomb. They openly talk about turning Korea into a sea of fire and so forth. But actually they are not in a position to do so because South Korea does have alliance pact with the United States, and even China is not in favor of North Korea's attack upon South Korea, even though China and North Korea do have alliance pact. It is supposed to be applied only in case North Korea or China is attacked by an aggressor country. Therefore, when we talk about this responsibility to protect, although, as I said, it has a legal footing in law, according to many scholars and protections of international affairs. As a matter of fact, it could not mean too much thing when international community try to apply it in such countries as North Korea, which does possess nuclear bomb. I don't know whether I answered your question. Yes? Yes? Any other questions? Yes? Yes, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor, for your presentation. My question is, coming from Africa and from Nigeria in particular, currently as I speak to you, 3 states have been declared state of emergency.
Pardon?
3 states, 1, 2, 3 states. State of emergency has been declared on them due to issues of violence, killings, and some of them are political in nature, some of them are religious in nature, in different dimensions though. But in essence, my question finally is, at what point of a nation's situation, like the genocide, the killing, or whichever form of violence is taking place in a country, should R2P be implemented or
Yes.
taken over by the UN?
That's important and interesting question. As a matter of fact, if there was violation of one person, nobody thinks about this invocation of this responsibility to protect. But when massive violation of human rights take place, massive violation of human rights, such as killing of many people, atrocious act committed by rulers of a country, then this concept could be invoked. But whenever this concept is to be applied in actual situations, unfortunately, there has to be agreement among 5 veto exercising powers in the Security Council, because according to the written agreement at the summit, this right is to be exercised on the condition that Security Council agrees to it. And Security Council is the place where veto makes difference. So if any one of 5 veto wielding powers try to stand in the way, they cannot invoke this concept. See, that is the weakness. This is the weakness of this concept in concrete situation. Yes. Yes. Right? I have a bad hearing. I think it has not to do with cold.
Thank you, Professor. I want to ask a question about the North Korea defectors. And I know that Korean government always blames China on the reparation issue. So some criticism point out that if China could not accept the defectors, they should at least send them to South Korea or America. So I want to know about your opinion on this suggestion.
Very interesting and important question. See, there is a convention, Refugee Convention of 1965. And according to that convention, any nation of any country, decide to leave the country, of decide to leave the country of his or her own, then with political motives, in other words, if North Korean decide to leave North Korea for political reasons because of political repression and so forth, under the Refugee Convention of 1965, he or she should be regarded as a refugee. And in case he or she is regarded as a refugee under that convention, the country concerned, which accept that refugee, should not repatriate the person or persons concerned to the country of the origin. That's their obligation. And China and South Korea and North Korea are party to that convention. Therefore, China is under strict legal obligation not to repatriate, not to turn back refugees who try to leave who left North Korea because of her or his fear of political repression. But what actually happens is something of serious interest to South Korea, because China does have its own boundary agreement with North Korea, under which economic immigrants or those who come to China to seek better economic opportunities, they have a freedom to, they have perfect right to return them back to North Korea. But when a North Korea who fled to China as political refugees, they have no right to do so. But the practice of China has been that they turn them back to North Korea, knowing that once they are repatriated to their country, they are to be put in a political camp. Political detention camp. So we have been making lots of efforts to persuade China not to do so. But sometimes they accept our request, depending upon specific cases. For instance, Hwang Chang-yeop, who was the inventor of Juche ideology in North Korea, defected to China. And China let him come to South Korea. So he lived in South Korea until 2 years ago. And he was champion of Juche. He was, as a matter of fact, creator of Juche ideology, in which Kim Il-sung took great pride. So depending upon specific cases, China acts this way or the other way. So we try to persuade China not to do so repeatedly through diplomatic efforts and by all other means. But they don't agree with us. Sometimes they say that they are simply economic migrants, that they have nothing to do with political persecution in North Korea. Therefore, they tend to send them back to North Korea. And they often invoke boundary agreement they concluded with North Korea. Under the boundary agreement, indeed, if anyone comes to China to seek better economic opportunities, they have a right to turn them back. Yes. Yes?
How do you feel about Japan's quest for a permanent seat on the Security Council?
Japan's chance?
Yeah.
They say Japan's chance to come to Security Council as a member. Well, they have a good chance to come back to, and they have a good chance to sit on Security Council. As a matter of fact, practice of Japan is that given their economic and political influence projected all around, they believe they should come back, they should sit on Security Council at the interval of 5 years. 5 years, that's what they believe. And they have been doing with that rotational principle rather well because of the strong support they gather from many countries of the UN. And, but I don't know, these days, Japan is headed for militaristic direction these days. And therefore, I think many countries in our part of the world feel very uncomfortable with what's going on in Japan these days, because Japanese political leadership openly talks about making Japan a normal country. No, we have no reservation whatsoever about making Japan a normal country as South Korea or other countries. But the thing is, if they want to be a nuclear power, because they have 40 tons of plutonium with which they can make several nuclear bombs in a matter of few months. But if they want to seek a kind of superior position in our part of the world in particular, given their history, I think no country in Asia would support their wish to do so. So we have yet to see. We are we are very much concerned about political direction currently Japanese political leadership takes. We have no objection whatsoever making Japan a normal state, as I said. But when Japan wishes to become a nuclear power, then it seriously complicates the situation in this part of the world. In our part of the world, Northeast Asia. And tension exists these days between China, Korea on the one hand, and Japan because of Japanese, how should I put it, very aggressive views uttered by Japanese political leadership. So we have yet to see how well they are going to do in the forthcoming upper chambers election. In Japan, they are going to have upper houses election very soon. If Abe is to gain 2/3 majority of supporters in the upper chamber of House there, I think he will become a more daring person in order to make Japan a perhaps nuclear power. I hope not. Yes, somebody raised. Yes. Okay, she's telling me that time is available only for a couple of more questions. Yes, please, you have the floor.
Thank you for your presentation. In recent past, Myanmar government was also involved in genocides of Rohingyas, but the UN response was not timely and decisively. So, Myanmar. Yes, genocides of Rohingyas. I want to know what actions taken by the UN at that time.
I haven't have any information concerning genocide is going on in Myanmar. Did you say that genocide is taking place in Myanmar?
Yes. Hundreds of people killed by government-led forces and.
Are you from ASEAN countries? Because if genocide is taking place in Myanmar, I think the attention of the United Nations GA could have been paid to that situation. But I think as far as I could tell, no ASEAN countries nor any other country of the United Nations talked about genocide taking place in Myanmar. I don't know. Well, yes. See, if indeed such crime as genocide is taking place in Myanmar, I think ASEAN should take the lead to bring the matter either to the Security Council or before the General Assembly, so that international community headed by the UN should address the situation. Myanmar.
I read from
Myanmar is, as a matter of fact, headed for democratization. I understand that they are
yes.
going to have democratic elections soon, no?
I read from newspapers and from the net that, and I saw pictures of killings on mass level.
I see. But I have no information whatsoever about, never heard about genocide taking place in that country. Perhaps I may be wrong, I don't know. I will have to look at newspaper clips in order to see what kind of killings are taking place in that country. I thought the democratic election is being planned, I understand. Well, I could be wrong. Mm-hmm. Okay, one more question, please. Oh, yes.
Yes, yeah, during this lecture, you mentioned about the weakness of the Security Council in the decision making due to the veto system. Is there any ongoing movement or approach to solve these problems within the UN?
Again, this question is a matter of fact. Security Council reform debate has been going on a long time. See, I was in New York back in 1995. There was a working group devoted to reforming the Security Council in order to make it more responsive to address exigencies of the accidents that take place in various parts of the world. But again, in order to reform the Security Council, we have to have agreements of veto exercising powers. So if any country, any one of them, any one of 5, if they don't agree to revision of the reform, invention of the Security Council reform can never be advanced. That's it. That's it. Fact. That's the reason why GA had the working group for a long time. I think still they have a sort of working group with different names, but they could not advance what they want to do. No. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes, please. The last question. Oh.
Thank you. I want to know the working relationship between the UN Security Council and then the West, especially the United States. It has been a perception that US is playing double standards when it comes to world peace. Africa is much associated with sort of wars. Governments are always in a form of military regimes, and the AU level, they are trying to work on that, encourage countries to always choose their leaders through democratic means. And my question is coming to Libya's situation. AU does not want to recognize any form of rebels that pass through guns to become a government or a leader of a particular country. So AU wanted to go to Libya with a sort of continental intervention. But the West just came in with their own powers, and then they did what they have just done. And yet they encourage African countries or AU level to work with peace. I don't know their stand. Thank you.
Can you help me? Precise question. I have a very bad cold. I think Western powers could not have intervened in Libyan situation without having had adequate formal or informal consultations with African Union leadership. Because after all, Libya is part of Africa, and you have a stronger voice than Western powers. Therefore, when Western powers decide to intervene in that country, it's impossible without having support from Arab League and African Union. Therefore, I think my understanding is that they did have adequate amount of consultations and negotiations, perhaps, with African Union as well as Arab League, in order to make that decision to attack Libya with Air Force. Good. So, in other words, AU was consulted adequately before the Western powers took action. Okay? Okay, thank you very much for your attention. I appreciate it. I apologize for my bad cold, and I think you had quite difficulty in understanding what I had to say. Thank you.